the view ahead for the JSE? Well, Nesan, Nair, Senior Portfolio Manager at Sasfin Securities, joins us now for his view. Nesan, thanks very much indeed.
Good evening, Dave.
For coming in. I want to touch on the economy as well here, but let's start with the JSE. The local market, 11% down in total for 2018. That's a staggering amount, especially when you consider the fact that I think it was the sort of deepest plunge in 10 years.
Yep.
But the JSE is not alone, of course. I mean, there was volatility on the global market overall last year.
Well, last year was a terrible year for all global markets. You know, the only market that was up for most of the year was the US markets, and that only took place until December. In December, you know, the US markets turned negative year to date, and we ended up in a situation where markets across the world were actually down. Chinese markets were down 20%. Most of the European markets in South Africa, we were up. We were down in the mid double digits, and the US market was slightly down. So it's certainly the last. You said the last 10 years. The last time this happened was 10 years ago. So I don't think, you know, a lot of market participants are very familiar with this sort of movement.
When we look at 2019, now, of course, we got an election year coming up domestically, but one would think that really, just given the weightings on the JSE, international movements this year would have more of an impact on the national election. I mean, is that true?
Absolutely. If you look at the big shares on the JSE, the likes of Anheuser-Busch, Naspers, British American, Richmond, Bidcorp, you know, these are all international companies that, for historic reasons, have a listing on the JSE. Mondi is another one. And given the state of international markets right now, you know, and we can talk about things like the trade wars in the US and, you know, the government meltdown in the US as well. Those events seem to be driving our market more and more. The currency does play a role, but, you know, the currency, I think the role the currency plays is to a lesser extent than actual international political and economic events.
Yeah. You can't say the same for economic growth, though, can you? So what are we expecting? Something in the region of 0.6% economic
We're hoping
growth?
that it'll be at least positive. Remember, the first two quarters we had negative growth.
Right.
We had positive growth in the third quarter. Fourth quarter numbers are not out, although, you know, judging from the holiday spending season, we expect it to be reasonably good. If we end the year up, the 2018 calendar year, up with positive economic growth, I think that'll be a good thing. But, you know, it's marginally positive. 0.8% is really flat.
But back to my question then, the election this year would have more of an impact on your economic growth front than the markets, for example, because here you're dealing with policy issues and you're dealing with uncertain, perhaps even reluctant investors watching.
I think the election is going to be closely watched by international investors particularly. Yeah. You know, locally we expect an ANC victory. But I think the ANC running up to the elections in May will try and put a very united front out. We know that they're split on various policy issues. You know, the extent of the split and the extent of how divided the different regions in the ANC are, I think will only reflect in the election result. But what the investor community is looking at locally and globally is a consistent, stable policy environment, and that can only come through you know, with a reasonably comfortable win by the ANC. So don't expect there to be too much of activity leading up to the election. Having said that, there may be a lot of volatility depending on what sort of statements are made by the leading party.
I wonder where that leaves the investment pledges of last year. I mean, we've seen multi-billion rand pledges coming out of that job summit, then there was the investment summit. When does that eventually materialize to softening this rather disastrous 27.7 unemployment rate? I mean, does it happen this year, at least start to happen?
You know, I think there's a lot of spin that came along with those pledges. Certainly, I think if there's anybody that can deliver on them, it's President Ramaphosa. You know, he's best positioned to do that. But to address things like the 27% unemployment rate that you mentioned, you know, we need structural changes in the economy. This is not going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. We need, you know, more skills, more education. We need to grow the economy in areas that are growing globally, like things like technology. We need to upgrade our infrastructure, roll out more 3G. The concern a lot of investors have is that the impediments to the growth in infrastructure are really government policy. I mean, if you look at something like digital terrestrial television, the licensing for that hasn't been approved by government yet. And so, the telcos can't roll out the necessary infrastructure before the licensing can come through. The land issue is another one. Nobody's going to build hotels and office blocks and things if there's concern around land tenure. So those issues around policy need to be addressed first before investors have certainty about whether they're going to invest or not.
And I suppose that is exactly why investor confidence is such a big component to economic growth. I want to just bring it back to the markets. I mean, I would imagine that volume on the JSE is still pretty much thin, picking up though, with the real working week starting today.
Yeah, we've got about 40% volumes. Volumes in the JSE roughly run around, on a reasonably good day, maybe 20, 25 billion. That's the sort of number that we expect to see changing hands. And we're at slightly less than half that right now. But it's not, anything sinister. It's just that, a lot of people are still on holiday and still getting back and things. So I wouldn't read too much about market movements, while the volumes are still so thin.
All right, we'll leave it there. Nesan, Nair from Sasfin. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us from Sasfin Securities.